Good morning and welcome to the Sunday morning sermon for Black Rock Baptist Church. And we've been working through a series of messages entitled Keep Calm and Trust God. This is number 8 in this series. We're looking at Genesis chapter 40, verses 23 through chapter 41, verse 40. And we're going to look today on dealing with delay in life. You know, what are we focusing on today, or what we're focusing on today in this particular sermon is what we'll call the waiting rooms of life. Have you ever noticed that some rooms kind of speak for themselves? You walk into a freshly decorated nursery prepared by proud parents, and immediately that room speaks of joy and excitement and anticipation. You enter into a cozy den on a cold winter evening, and the fire in the fireplace casting shadows all around the room, and there's an invitation there to come in and sit down and enjoy that atmosphere. Or walking into a dining room just before a Thanksgiving meal, sitting down and enjoying the food and hear the sound of friendly voices. The room just reverberates with a warm welcome. But other rooms are not nearly so inviting. Some rooms are distinctively lonely, regardless of how many people are in them. There's a frightening uncertainty that prevails. Such are the waiting rooms of life. As a pastor, I've had occasion to spend time in the waiting rooms of medical institutions. And there you can experience the full gamut of human emotions. These waiting rooms are difficult rooms. They're challenging. And yet, throughout our lifetime, we all have to experience and be involved in those waiting rooms of life. It may be that your health has put you in the waiting room. It may be family issues. It may be that the opportunities that you have thought were going to come your way have not materialized. But regardless of what kind of waiting room you might find yourself in today, it's difficult to deal with the waiting rooms of life. We are not used to waiting. We don't like waiting for anything. Well, it's true that Joseph again teaches us some critical insight to successful living in these chapters we're going to look at this morning. He too was faced with a waiting room. You'll remember that Joseph had been in prison on false charges, and while he was in prison, two of the king's chief officials, the king's cupbearer and the king's baker, were also thrown into prison for displeasing the king. And the two men both had dreams. They were distressed as to the meaning of those dreams, and Joseph volunteered to interpret the dreams for them. The cupbearer was to be restored. That was the meaning of his dream. And Joseph volunteered to interpret that dream for him. The cupbearer was to be restored to his former position, but the baker was to lose his life. He was to be hanged. When Joseph interpreted the cupbearer's dream, he asked that the royal cupbearer do a favor for him. He said to him in chapter 40, verse 14, "But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me. Make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house." As is often the case, when we're in a period of waiting and things don't work out like we wish they would, we get discouraged. In Genesis chapter 40, verse 23, it says, "Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him." When we left Joseph last week, he was alone in prison, forgotten by the man who had promised to remember him. And here again, Joseph teaches us a critical insight to successful living. He too was faced with a waiting room. And now, after 2 years, we pick up the story again. And in verse 1 of chapter 41, we read, "Then it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream. And behold, he stood by the river." Those 2 full years, as far as we know, were neither exciting or eventful for Joseph. They represented long, dull, monotonous time spent in the prison. Month after month, the same old prison walls. That's what it's like when you're in a period of waiting. Nothing seems to happen. You just wait and you wait and you wait. And while there are several thoughts I want you to see, we'll begin this morning with this first thought on how we can successfully deal with delay. And that first thought is this: we should not be surprised by periods of delay. The New Testament tells us in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 12, "Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to come to you, as though some strange thing has happened to you." If you read through any of the books of the Bible, you will find that the saints had to deal with all kinds of frustration and disappointment and hardship in their lives. Abraham had to wait for decades to have a son that God had promised to him. Moses spent 40 years on the backside of the desert tending sheep before he had an opportunity at 80 years of age to lead the children of Israel out of captivity and into the land of Egypt. Even then, Moses spent another 40 years leading Israel in circles before getting to the promised land. And when they arrived, God did not allow them to go in. God worked while his people were waiting and waiting and waiting. Disappointment comes to all of our lives. Things don't always go the way we expect them to. People we love die. We don't always get credit that we deserve. Sometimes we're victims of injustice in life. Sometimes in life we can struggle. But has there ever been a life in which there was more wild ups and downs than the life of Joseph? From favorite son to slave in a foreign land, from slave in Potiphar's house to overseer of Potiphar's house, from overseer to a prison, from prison to a counselor to Pharaoh. Certainly, we all have ups and downs in life, but it just seems like Joseph must have felt that he was on a roller coaster. So the number one thing we need to learn here is that we need to learn that we should not be surprised by the delays that we experience in life. Number two, when we do experience the delays of life, we need to learn to trust in God alone. Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 5 says, "Thus says the Lord, cursed is the man who trusts in man and makes flesh his strength, whose heart departs from the Lord. For he shall be like a shrub in the desert, and shall not see when good comes, but shall inhabit the parched places in the wilderness, in a salt land that is not inhabited." Joseph's life was not however, all fluctuation and change. There was one great constant in Joseph's life, and we see it shining through in each situation that Joseph encounters. And that constant is God. In every situation encountered by Joseph, we see him give priority to God in his life. Joseph had a hope that was beyond mere earthly hope. His faith was in God, not in Potiphar, not in the cupbearer, not even in the king of Egypt. When men failed him, he knew that God was still with him, even when he was in prison. The forgetfulness of man should not cause us to, or should cause us to reflect upon the faithfulness of God. The prophet Isaiah reveals that God has promised. He says, "You will not be forgotten by me." That is what enabled Joseph to endure in the midst of distress and deep sorrow. When we find ourselves in the waiting room, in the holding pattern of life, we need to remember that God is with us and that He uses these experiences to help us mature in life. Number 3, when we find ourselves in a waiting period in life, in the waiting rooms of life, we need to wait for God's timing. Chapter 41, the first 15 verses, it reads this way: "Then it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Potiphar had a dream, and behold, he stood by a river. Suddenly there came up out of the river 7 cows, looking fine and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came after them out of the river, ugly and gaunt, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the river. And the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 fine-looking fat cows. So Pharaoh awoke. He slept and dreamed a second time. And suddenly 7 heads of grain came up on one stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 thin heads, belighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. And the 7 thin heads devoured the 7 plump and full heads. So Pharaoh awoke, and indeed it was a dream. Now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent for all the magicians of Egypt and all of its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was not one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. The king had a dream. In his dream, he saw 7 well-fed cows come up out of the Nile River, and then immediately 7 undernourished cows come up out of the Nile, and they immediately devoured the 7 well-fed cows. While he was puzzling as to the meaning of that dream, he goes back to sleep and he has a second dream. This time we're told that the 7 healthy heads of grain were devoured by 7 thin, scorched heads of grain. When Pharaoh awakened the second time, we're told he's deeply troubled at this point. Pharaoh no doubt saw the similarities and the contrast in the 2 dreams. In both dreams, there was a series of 7s followed by a second set of 7s. The first set of 7s involved prosperity. The second set of 7s involved a lack of prosperity. Also notable was that the second set of 7s in each dream devoured the first set that had been prosperous. But what did all of this mean? Pharaoh consulted with the wisest men of the country, but no one could interpret his dreams. And then in the middle of all the panic in the palace, the cupbearer finally remembers his prison experience, and he told the king of the young captive Hebrew that was there. He says in verses 9 through 13, I remember my faults this day. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, both me and the chief baker, we each had a dream one night. Each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now, there was a young Hebrew man with us, a servant of the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each man he interpreted according to his own dream. And it came to pass just as he interpreted for us. So it happened. He restored me to my office, and he hanged him. Number 4, when we find ourselves in the waiting room of life, when we find ourselves in a waiting period, we need to remember that we choose how we will respond to the difficult time. We choose how we're going to respond. It says, then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon. And he shaved and changed his clothing and came to Pharaoh. Joseph was hurriedly brought out of the dungeon, but he did not face Pharaoh until he had first shaved and changed his clothing. This was not just a matter of getting cleaned up, but it was a cultural concession. To the Hebrews, a beard was a mark of dignity, but to the Egyptians, it was an offensive thing. Joseph took the time to shave in order that to not unnecessarily offend the king. When Joseph was brought into Pharaoh's presence, the king immediately told him of his distressing dreams. In verse 15, it says, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that you can understand a dream and interpret it. When he was called upon to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, how could he help but remember his own dreams as a 17-year-old? Dreams that stirred up jealousy and hatred amongst his brothers. It seemed that every time Joseph uses his God-given talent, he ends up getting burned. He used it anyway because he deeply trusts God in every situation of life. It's significant that Joseph's first and foremost concern is to glorify God. 2 years earlier, he had used his opportunity to tell his own plight to the cupbearer, but about the injustice he had served or suffered. But not this time. He uses this occasion to talk to Pharaoh about his dream. Egypt's plight, and there's nothing said about himself. Joseph says, it's not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. It's impressive to note Joseph's repeated references to God. It's not me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. The thing established by God, God is about it. And Joseph did not in any way seek to accommodate the theological belief system of Pharaoh. Instead, Joseph immediately focuses all the attention on the one true God. Likewise, if we are to take advantage of the opportunities that God may give us, we have to overcome the hesitant, compromising tendency to try and accommodate everyone else's belief system and to never offend anyone, and like Joseph, just make it very crystal clear that this is of God, the one true God. Pharaoh then recounts his dream to Joseph. Joseph replies that the two dreams, while different in some details, were one in their meaning. The bottom line was that Egypt would experience 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine, so severe that all the previous reserves would be used up. Joseph not only interpreted the dreams, he went on to give wise discernment on how to deal with what was coming, this famine. He said, Pharaoh, here is what you need to do as soon as possible. First of all, find a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. And secondly, appoint commissioners over the land and take 1/5 of the grain from the farmers each harvest during the 7 good years, to be used during the 7 years of famine, so that the nation will not be ruined by famine. It's my own belief that Joseph did not give this advice with any idea that he would be the one that would be appointed over this project. If he dared to hope at all, it would have been a hope to be released from imprisonment as a reward for this. How far beyond his imagination it must have been, his elevation to a position of power and prestige. And so it is with God. Genesis chapter 41, verses 37 and 38 tell us, so the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? It was obvious even to Pharaoh that Joseph was speaking not of his own wisdom, but under the influence of the Holy Spirit. Even the pagan advisors to the king and the king himself could not resist his words. Well, the end result is in Genesis chapter 41, verses 39 and 40. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, insomuch as God has shown you all of this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. Pharaoh deemed Joseph as wise and understanding. The biblical expression wise and understanding is applied to only one other person in Scripture, and that's King Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 12. Perhaps to the casual observer, it would seem that in all of this, there is just a great deal of, well, what we call coincidence. But Moses, acting as a historian here, directed by the Spirit of God, lifts the veil and allows us to see that it is God who has been at work the whole time, step by step, working out his own infinite plans. It's much more than just elevating and rewarding Joseph's faithfulness. It was all a part of a great plan. It consisted of bringing the people of Israel back to a living faith and causing them to grow into a great nation. All of Joseph's circumstances flowed out of that plan. Each circumstance in Joseph's life advanced the plan. Joseph excelled because he accepted that God had a plan for his life and that the circumstances of his life flowed from that plan. He gave himself to the business of using whatever circumstances were to honor and glorify God. Let me tell you, all too often, we're more concerned with trying to dictate to God what our circumstances should be rather than seeking to use our circumstances to glorify God. We not only have the method by which we think our problem should be solved, but we've got the timetable as well. And yet God will often not work to either our method or our timetable. Friends, we should be living in such a way that an unbelieving world would see that there is a God who is supreme, that there is a God who has a plan. And when difficult situations unfold, or we find ourselves in a waiting period, in the waiting rooms of life, instead of asking why, we should be asking how we can use that waiting time, how we can use that waiting room of life to bring honor and glory to the one true God, the Lord of all. When we find ourselves in the waiting room of life, don't be surprised by the delay. Learn to trust in God alone. Wait for God's timing. And remember, we have a choice as to how we will respond to our situation. God bless. Have a wonderful day, and until we meet again, let's continue to exchange prayers daily.